Some people are born with killer instincts. Others have them forged in the fires of humiliation. The champagne flute felt cold against my palm as I sat alone at the far end of the polished mahogany table, watching my mother hold court at the annual partners' dinner of Sterling and Vance LLP. The private dining room at the St. Regis Hotel buzzed with the kind of energy that only comes when New York's most powerful attorneys gather to celebrate another record-breaking year. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across faces worth millions in billable hours, and the air was thick with expensive cologne and even more expensive egos. I had been to dozens of these dinners over the years, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the whispers seemed louder, the sideways glances more pointed, the air more suffocating. I caught fragments of conversations as partners leaned toward each other, their voices carrying just enough for me to hear every cutting word. Still living off her parents at 28? Harvard law degree gathering dust. Such a disappointment after all that investment. My mother, Eleanor Vance, stood at the head of the table like a queen addressing her subjects. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe chignon that matched her razor-sharp Armani suit, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had clawed her way to the top of Manhattan's legal elite. She raised her glass, and the room fell silent. "Another exceptional year for Sterling and Vance," she began, her tone dripping with self-satisfaction. "We've expanded our international presence, secured landmark victories, and once again proven why we're the premier corporate law firm in the city." She paused, her cold blue eyes scanning the room before landing on me with surgical precision. "Of course, not everyone in the family has had such a stellar year. My daughter Nadia is still exploring opportunities despite her Harvard Law credentials. Such a pity when talent doesn't translate to achievement." The words hit like physical blows, but I kept my expression neutral. I had learned long ago that showing weakness in front of these sharks was For the past 6 months, since my failed startup venture had become public knowledge, these dinners had become my personal circle of hell. But something was different tonight. Something was about to change everything. My phone buzzed against my thigh. I glanced down discreetly at the screen, and my pulse quickened as I read the message. "Final signatures confirmed. Transfer complete. You now own them all." I looked up to find my mother still speaking, her voice growing more animated as she warmed to her favorite topic, my failures. "Rather than wasting time on these silly entrepreneurial fantasies," she continued, gesturing dismissively in my direction, "perhaps Nadia should consider something more realistic. What was that company called again, dear?" Every eye in the room turned to me. I could feel their collective anticipation, their hunger for another morsel of my humiliation to feast on. I set down my champagne flute and met my mother's gaze with a steady smile. "Global Legal Solutions," I said clearly. The laughter that erupted was even louder this time. Arthur Sterling nearly choked on his brandy, and someone at the far end of the table actually applauded sarcastically. "Oh, another spectacular failure," my mother said, her voice thick with mock sympathy. "You know, darling, I could make a few calls. Perhaps secure you an entry-level position at some small firm. Filing, copying, answering phones. Nothing too challenging, of course." I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the marble floor. The room gradually quieted as all 50 of New York's most influential lawyers turned their attention to me. I could feel their collective assumption that I was about to flee in tears, as I had so many times before. Instead, I walked to the head of the table with measured steps, my heels clicking authoritatively against the floor. "Actually," I said, pulling out my tablet and connecting it to the room's presentation system, "I have some important news about global legal solutions that I think everyone should hear." My mother's perfectly applied lipstick curved into a condescending smirk. "Nadia, please, don't turn this into a stage for your little fantasies. We're a private partnership. Our shares aren't available on the open market." I advanced to the next slide, showing the acquisition timeline in precise detail. "You really should have read the fine print in those merger documents you signed last month, Mother. The ones you were too busy to review personally, because you believed such matters were beneath the attention of a managing partner." I paused, savoring the moment. "Particularly subsection C of the Technology Integration Clause on page 247. Arthur Sterling was frantically scrolling through his phone, his face growing paler by the second. "The golden parachute provisions," he whispered. "They only apply to traditional corporate takeovers." "Exactly," I confirmed, clicking to the next slide. "Tech company acquisitions are explicitly excluded. A loophole you all overlooked, because you were so certain that my little startup could never pose a real threat." The room erupted into chaos as partners began shouting questions, demanding explanations, making frantic phone calls. Through it all, I stood calmly at the front of the room, watching my mother's world crumble with the same clinical detachment she had always shown toward my pain. Eleanor's personal assistant burst through the dining room doors, her face white with panic. "Ms. Vance, the merger is complete, but there's been some kind of mistake with the ownership transfer. All the shares have been reassigned to Global Legal Solutions," I finished for her. "There's no mistake, Janet. It's exactly as intended." My father, Richard, who had been conspicuously silent throughout the evening's festivities, finally found his voice. "You can't fire your own mother, Nadia. It's impossible." I smiled at him with genuine warmth for the first time in years. "Actually, Dad, I can. Effective immediately." I clicked to the next slide, revealing the new organizational chart. "Although I'm happy to offer Mother a position more suited to her particular skill set." Eleanor was staring at the screen in horror. "What position?" "Junior associate. Starting salary, $42,000 annually. Though you'll need to interview for it, of course. Assuming you make it past the first round." The sound of my mother's "I've already spoken with the major accounts. Turns out, they're quite excited about working with a firm that doesn't still rely on fax machines and refuses to embrace digital innovation." I paused, letting that sink in. "Governor Hernandez is particularly enthusiastic about our new approach to environmental law. He'll be calling me directly after dinner." The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic phone calls, desperate negotiations, and increasingly creative attempts to undo what couldn't be undone. Security escorted several former partners from the building after they became too aggressive in their demands for exceptions and special considerations. I watched it all from my new corner office on the 50th floor, the one that had been my mother's kingdom until this afternoon. The next morning brought a parade of cardboard boxes as former partners cleaned out their offices under the watchful eyes of security guards. I had Janet, who had smoothly transitioned from my mother's assistant to mine overnight, set up meetings with department heads to discuss the firm's new direction. It was remarkable how quickly people adapted when their paychecks depended on it. My parents arrived for the third time that morning, just as I was finishing a conference call with our new clients in Silicon Valley. Through the security monitors, I could see my mother clutching a worn Prada bag, and my father holding a thick folder of what I assumed were legal documents meant to challenge the takeover. "Send them up," I told Janet, "and please, continue calling me Miss Carter." I had legally changed my name 6 months earlier as part of my preparation for this moment. But the irony of my mother's own surname being used to destroy her was too delicious to waste. They entered my office with the desperate energy of people who still believed they could negotiate their way out of disaster. My mother's usual confidence had been replaced by barely contained panic, while my father looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. "The Bar Association will file an injunction," Eleanor declared without preamble. "This kind of acquisition violates partnership agreements dating back decades." I leaned back in my chair, the same chair she had occupied with such authority just yesterday. "The Bar Association isn't particularly We were trying to teach you resilience, to prepare you for the real world." "Congratulations," I said, standing up and walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Central Park. It worked. My father held up his folder desperately. "We'll challenge this in court. Every firm in the city will support us." "With what money?" I asked, not turning around. "Your accounts have been frozen pending the ownership transition. Standard procedure for corporate restructuring." I could see their reflection in the window. 2 small figures dwarfed by the mahogany and marble of the office they had once ruled. "As for other firms supporting you, I wouldn't count on it. Most of them are rather excited about acquiring some of Sterling and Vance's former clients." Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "The clients will follow us." "To where?" I finally turned to face them, and I could see the exact moment when the reality of their situation truly hit them. "You have no firm, no capital, no resources, and a non-compete clause that prevents you from practicing corporate law in New York for the next 3 years." I walked back to my desk and picked up a document. "A clause you both signed when you agreed to the merger terms." My phone rang, and Janet's voice came through the intercom. "Miss Carter, Governor Hernandez is on line 1. I looked at my parents, these 2 people who had spent my entire adult life making me feel small and worthless. And I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine satisfaction. "Tell the governor I'll take his call now," I said to Janet. Then, to my parents, "Security will escort you out. I'm afraid you no longer have authorization to be in this building." As they were led away, my mother turned back one last time. "You'll regret this, Nadia." This kind of ruthlessness always comes back to haunt you. I picked up the phone and smiled. Perhaps. But I learned from the best. The line connected, and Governor Hernandez's familiar voice filled the room. "Miss Carter." I had kept exactly 3 employees from the old Sterling and Vance. Janet, who had proved invaluable during the transition. Marcus Rodriguez, a brilliant young associate who had been consistently overlooked because he didn't fit the firm's old boy network. And surprisingly, Harold Chen, the night security guard who had always treated me with more respect than my own parents ever had. My mother and father had eventually found work at a small firm in New Jersey, handling real estate closings and personal injury cases, a far cry from the corporate law empire they had once ruled. They sent the occasional email demanding meetings or reconciliation, but I had learned the most important lesson of all. Some bridges are meant to be burned. As I sat in my office that evening, reviewing contracts for our latest expansion into international markets, Janet knocked on my door. "Your 7 o'clock is here," she said. "The documentary crew from Forbes." I nodded and straightened my jacket. They wanted to interview me for a feature story about women disrupting traditional industries, about how I had built a legal empire from nothing in less than a year. They didn't know the whole story, of course. They saw a brilliant entrepreneur who had identified market inefficiencies and exploited them with surgical precision. They didn't see the scared young woman who had sat through countless humiliating dinners, absorbing every cruel word until she was ready to turn that pain into power. But perhaps that was for the best. After all, the most satisfying victories are the ones where your enemies never see you coming, until it's far too late to stop you. And as I prepared to tell my story to the world, I realized that this was just the beginning. I had spent 28 years learning how to lose gracefully. Now I was ready to spend the rest of my life learning how to win ruthlessly. The little girl who had once dreamed of making her parents proud was gone. In her place sat a woman who had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the freedom to disappoint the people who never believed in you. The firm now employs over 300 attorneys across 15 offices, and our annual revenue has exceeded every projection I dared to make in those early planning stages. But success, I've learned, tastes different when you've earned it through your own merit, rather than inherited it through family connections. Every morning when I arrive at our headquarters, now housed in a gleaming tower we purchased and renovated in Lower Manhattan, I feel the weight of what we've built together. The old Sterling and Vance offices have been converted into our New York branch, a constant reminder of how far we've come. Last month, I received an invitation to speak at the Harvard Law School commencement ceremony. As I stood at that podium, looking out at hundreds of bright young faces filled with hope and ambition, I found myself thinking about the girl I used to be, the one who believed that love and approval had to be earned through perfection and submission. I told those graduates something I wish someone had told me years earlier, that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not trying to fix broken relationships, but having the strength to walk away from them entirely. The invitation to my parents' anniversary party arrived last week, forwarded through 3 different addresses before reaching my assistant. 40 years of marriage, the card read, as if those 4 decades represented something worth celebrating, rather than something that had nearly destroyed their only child. I read it once, then placed it in the shredder beside my desk. Some chapters close not with dramatic confrontations or tearful reconciliations, but with the quiet certainty that you finally learn to protect your own peace. Janet knocked on my door, interrupting my reflection. "The partnership meeting is ready to begin," she said. "And, Miss Carter, your interview with the Wall Street Journal has been rescheduled for tomorrow morning. They want to feature you on the cover of their weekend edition." I nodded and gathered my materials for the meeting. Our partners, all brilliant attorneys I had handpicked for their skill and integrity, rather than their connections or pedigrees, were waiting in our conference room. As I walked toward them, with deep connections to federal agencies. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were now in a position to acquire firms that had once looked down on us. The partners are desperate, Marcus explained, spreading financial documents across our conference table. 3 major clients pulled out last month after some unfortunate publicity about their employment practices. They're hemorrhaging money and talent. I studied the numbers, recognizing several names from my mother's old Rolodex. These were the same attorneys who had attended those painful dinners, who had laughed at my failures and whispered about my inadequacies. Now they were coming to us, hat in hand, begging for salvation. "What are they asking for?" I inquired. "A full buyout with retention of senior partners," Marcus replied. "They want to maintain their current compensation structure and decision-making authority." The room fell silent as my partners waited for my response. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the bustling streets of Manhattan below, filled with ambitious young lawyers who probably reminded those senior partners of themselves 20 years ago. The cycle continued, generation after generation. But perhaps it didn't have to continue in the same destructive pattern. "Counteroffer," I said finally. "Full acquisition, but we restructure everything. Current partners can stay as senior associates with merit-based advancement opportunities. No guaranteed positions, no special treatment. They earn their way up, just like everyone else." I paused, thinking of all the talented attorneys who had been held back by the old boys network. "And we implement our standard diversity and inclusion protocols immediately." My partners nodded in agreement. We had built global legal solutions on the principle that talent and integrity mattered more than connections and pedigree. And we weren't about to compromise those values now, regardless of the prestige attached to acquiring a DC firm. After the meeting, I found myself alone in my office as the sun set over Manhattan. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Saw the Wall Street Journal announcement about the DC acquisition. As I prepared to leave the office, Janet appeared in my doorway one last time. "Miss Carter, the car is waiting downstairs. And there's something else." She smiled mysteriously. "Harvard Law Review called. They want to feature your environmental law innovations in their spring issue. The editor mentioned it would be the cover story." I gathered my things and headed toward the elevator, thinking about that scared young woman who had once sat in these very halls, desperate for approval from people who would never give it. She couldn't have imagined that one day she would be featured on the cover of the publication that had once rejected her law review submission. But then again, she couldn't have imagined a lot of things about the woman she would eventually become. The elevator doors closed and I smiled at my reflection in the polished steel. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to build something meaningful. And for the first time in my life, I would face them with the unshakable confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to apologize for it.